Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 2016 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture, which is jointly sponsored by the University of Tasmania, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Peter Boyce. I'm currently State President of AIIA. In introducing proceedings, it is my pleasant duty to acknowledge the Muhina Ngā people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which this campus was built. We have several official guests tonight, including several honorary consuls: Diane Bai, Consul for France and Germany; Bob Gordon, Consul to the Consulate of Finland; and Jenny Ellen Kennedy for the Royal Norwegian Consulate. And we also are happy to welcome Kathleen Plimsoll and Tony Cunnack from the Plimsoll family. And I should have mentioned also Sir Guy Green is present, and he's always welcome on these occasions. There are apologies from two members of the Plimsoll family, Susan and Jane, but it's good to have strong representation from the Plimsoll family here. My duties are almost at an end, I'm pleased to say, and now I have pleasure in inviting the Vice-Chancellor to highlight the origins and significance of the Plimsoll Lecture. Professor Peter Rathjen, Vice-Chancellor.
Thanks, Peter, and just to clear up some misconceptions at the outset, I've been asked what exotic location I might have gone to get sunburned in the way that I am at the moment. And the answer for those of you new to Tasmania is I've been to Bridport, and that's where you go. I can also just make clear that there are some of us who will have to leave towards the end of this speech tonight. It's because there's a clash, unfortunately, with the annual Council Cabinet dinner, and so some of us are here for as long as we can be and will then have to depart. It's no statement about either the quality of the speaker or the quality of the audience. And I say what a pleasure it is, though, to welcome you here to the University for what is the 7th Sir James Plimsoll Annual Lecture. I'd particularly like to welcome Sir James's nieces, Kathleen and Jane, and their families who've travelled from Sydney to attend the lecture. It's great to have them back here each year. At the Patrons' Dinner of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in 2005, then Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Alexander Downer, announced that the Department of Foreign Affairs would sponsor an annual Sir James Plimsoll Lecture featuring an Australian or international authority on international relations. It was agreed that the University of Tasmania would host the annual event in collaboration with the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Australian Institute of International Affairs. This lecture is part of the university's program of thought leadership, which includes and extends beyond the exchange of ideas within the academy. We have a deep commitment to stimulate and facilitate the practice of public debate and discussion. Through their inspiring and challenging presentations, those who have delivered the annual Sir James Plimsoll Lecture have made a significant contribution to the profile of the university as a leader in contemporary thinking on critical matters, and have helped to build and enhance relationships with the community and across the globe. Sir James Plimsoll was one of the most distinguished diplomats in the history of Australia's Department of External Affairs, which later became the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He was educated in New South Wales, receiving bachelor's degrees in economics and arts from the University of Sydney. After serving in the Australian Imperial Force in the Directorate of Research and Civil Affairs, Sir James was appointed to the Far Eastern Commission, tasked with overseeing the Allied Council for Japan during the occupation of that country. In 1950, he was sent as the Australian representative to the United Nations Commission for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea, where he formed a close working relationship with Syngman Rhee, the South Korean president. Sir James was appointed as Australia's permanent representative to the UN in 1959 and became Australia's High Commissioner to India and Ambassador to Nepal in 1962. He was chosen to be the head of the Department of External Affairs in 1965. In 1970, Sir James was appointed as Ambassador to the United States and in 1974 became Ambassador to the USSR. He was appointed as ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg and the EEC in 1977, and in 1980 became High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. His final diplomatic post was as ambassador to Japan in 1981 and 1982. He later served as the highly popular and respected Governor of Tasmania, and we're proud of our governors, from 1982 until his death in May 1987, only shortly after having his initial 5-year term extended. This extraordinary career may have been very different. In 1947, while based in the United States of America, he received a letter from Torliv Hitton, who was economic advisor to the Bank of New South Wales, advising of a vacancy for the position of Professor of Economics at University of Tasmania. Hitton encouraged Sir James to apply, which he did. He was not successful, instead becoming a first secretary of the Department of External Affairs. When he was Governor of Tasmania, Sir James developed a great interest in the university, and he was awarded an honorary doctorate in early 1987, not long before he died. I understand he liked to frequent the campus and occasionally would come in unannounced to browse in the university bookshop. His is an association that the university is greatly proud to celebrate and to mark with this lecture series. In May last year, here at the university, the Secretary of the Department of Defence, Mr. Dennis Richardson, launched Sir James's biography, Jim Plim, Ambassador Extraordinary. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Alopi Latikefu, State Director for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to introduce our speaker for this evening. Alopi.
Thank you, and it is wonderful to see you all tonight on what has been a long tradition in both DFAT and the University of Tasmania's lecture series, and one that we are very, very proud to continue to support in terms of our engagement and in terms of securing such venerable speakers as tonight's. It is my honour to introduce this year's distinguished 2016 Plimsoll Lecturer. Ambassador Jeffrey Bleich is a partner in the public policy and regulation practice. He served 4 years as US Ambassador to Australia and also as Special Counsel to President Obama in the White House. His law practice is focused on international and domestic litigation and counselling, with special emphasis on privacy and data security, internal investigations, trade and cross-border disputes in the Asia-Pacific region. Ambassador Bleich has represented many of America's leading companies in technology, security, media, finance and manufacturing sectors, as well as including as lead counsel in jury and bench trials and in appeals before the US Supreme Court, the California Supreme Court and numerous intermediate courts. In 2015, Ambassador Bleich was selected as a member of the American Arbitration Association's roster of arbitrators. As a certified arbitrator, he provides alternative dispute resolution services to individuals and organisations who wish to resolve commercial conflicts out of court, both domestically and internationally. Ambassador Bleich has been regularly listed among the Daily Journal's top 100 attorneys in California, honoured as a California Lawyer Attorney of the Year, and listed in Law Dragon 500 and in America's Best Lawyers as a top bet the company lawyer. He has also taught several courses at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and published extensively. Ambassador Bleich previously served as special counsel to President Obama from March to September 2009, before being appointed by the President to serve as the 24th United States Ambassador to Australia. As Ambassador, Ambassador Bleich's term was marked by the US rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, with Australia being the focal point for that shift. His efforts, included overseeing record growth in trade and investment between the US and Australia, bringing the Defence Trade Cooperation Treaty into force, establishing new alliance agreements for satellites and cybersecurity, executing a new space cooperation agreement that supported the Mars Curiosity rover landing, leading joint US-Australia efforts in Afghanistan's Uruzgan province, and promoting regional human rights efforts. For his federal service, Ambassador Bleisch has received numerous awards, including the highest civilian honour awarded by the Director of National Intelligence, the Distinguished Service Medal. In 2013, he received the State Department's highest award for a non-career ambassador, the Sue Cobb Prize for Exemplary Diplomatic Service. In addition to his professional practice and federal service, Ambassador Bleisch has served the state of California, overseeing the nation's largest higher education system as chair of the California State University Board of Trustees and the nation's largest bar association as president of the California State Bar from 2007 to 2008. He has also served as president of the Bar Association of San Francisco and as chair of the ABA's Amicus Curiae Committee, as well as chair or president of several other non-profit legal organisations. From 1998 to 1999, he served as director to the White House Commission on Youth Violence following the tragic Columbine shootings. Ambassador Bleisch currently serves as vice chair of the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, which my mother and my sister have both been recipients of, which is great to see, appointed by President Obama. He also serves by appointment of Governor Jerry Brown on the governor's 11-member International Trade and Investment Council, and has been elected as a life member to the American Law Institute and the Council of Foreign Relations. He has also served on the board of Pratt Industries as well as Willie Mays Say Hey Foundation. If all this was not enough, in 2009, the city of San Francisco named a day in his honour. So would you please welcome to the podium the 2016 Plimsoll Lecturer and former Ambassador to Australia, Mr. Jeffrey Bleisch.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction and the shout out to Fulbright. So congratulations to your family on being Fulbrighters. I'm actually the chair-elect now, so I will report back the great success here at University of Tasmania. Thank you, Peter Boyce. That was a lovely introduction of the event, and congratulations on your successful tenure with AIAA. The only thing better than being a president or chair is being a former president or chair, so, glad to deliver you back to your loved ones. And then Vice Chancellor Peter Routjen, thank you for the invitation to be here, for the warm remarks, and for giving me an excuse to be 17,047 kilometers away from the Washington, D.C. 2 weeks before the election. So, deeply honored to deliver the Sir James Plimsoll Lecture this evening. And there really is very little that I can add to the accolades that have already been directed to Sir James, or Jim Plim, as he was affectionately known. I'm honored to have Kathleen and Tony here representing the family. As you know, former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer said that there has never been a greater Australian diplomat than Sir James Plimsoll. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said that Sir James was such a great ambassador to the United States that Australia would have to be, quote, utterly mad to move Ambassador Plimsoll from his post. Just by contrast, I actually got to visit with Dr. Kissinger before I came out to be U.S. ambassador, and he said something a little different. He said he thought I'd do okay here precisely because Australia was just mad enough to accept me. So, although I wasn't here during Sir James's time, in some ways I feel that I was. I was fortunate to serve with many, many people here in Australia whose extraordinary careers had been nurtured by him. There's a reason why Australian diplomats and ambassadors have such disproportionate influence abroad, and it comes from lessons that Sir James imparted to them and demonstrated throughout the time of his career. Being an ambassador, I know well now, is a job. It's not a title. And Sir James knew how to do that job, how to build trust first, before he sought to try and influence others. He actually enjoyed people. He looked forward to working with them and to understanding them before he ever asked them to understand him. He had a gift for distilling complex ideas into simple and clear language. He was hungry for experience, and he used that experience in order to inform his judgment and to develop genuine wisdom. He recognized talent in others. He cultivated it. He wasn't threatened by it. And he wasn't afraid to do whatever it took. And I particularly recall from the Jeremy Hurd biography of him chasing President Syngman Rhee, a world leader, onto an airport runway while he's still wearing his pajamas. That's a sign that he's not afraid to do whatever it takes to advance Australia's interests. He was just a diplomat's diplomat, and he helped create a generation of men and women just like him, from Admiral and Vice Chief of Defense Forrest Ray Griggs to Nick Warner, who's now the Director General of ACES, to one of, in my opinion, Australia's greatest public servants, your current Secretary of Defense, Dennis Richardson. So for all those reasons, it's an extreme honor to deliver this address at such an exceptional time in U.S. history. Now, as students of diplomacy know, in order to become you got to be partisan in order to become the U.S. ambassador. You need to be nonpartisan in order to remain the U.S. ambassador. So I'm not used to discussing partisan political elections in Australia. Instead, whenever I was asked about elections, when I was here during the 2012 election, I did what diplomats have long done, which is I thought very carefully before saying nothing. So it's perhaps confirmation that I really am no longer the U.S. ambassador to Australia, and perhaps that some folks in Tasmania would like it to stay that way, that I've been asked to speak about the 2016 U.S. election tonight, and to do it a mere 2 weeks before it will be decided. I am happy to answer questions about the candidates for president and the state of the election during the question and answer afterwards, but I think it would be a disservice to Sir James and to the lecture series in his name to just give a set of predictions and assessments that will all lose relevance in a mere 2 weeks once the election's decided. So I'd like to offer some thoughts about the election that hopefully will endure past November 8. So tonight I'd like to talk about the defining features of this election and the domestic and the global forces that have produced it. Some of them are unique to the U.S., but many of them are manifest in all Western democracies. Let me talk about the defining feature of this election. This election has been a populist uprising against every candidate for president but one who has any record of the traditional qualifications for president. Let me start on the Democrat side. We had a popular governor, Martin O'Malley. He did not receive a single delegate in the Democratic primary. You had a former Secretary of the Navy and a very popular senator, Jim Webb, and you also had a very successful and popular governor and senator, Lincoln Chafee, both of whom never lasted long enough to find out whether they could win a single delegate. The most experienced, the best supported, the best funded candidate, a former Secretary of State, U.S. Senator, and the First Lady of both the United States and the state of Arkansas, was challenged all the way to the convention by a senator whose brand was being an outsider and who had had few legislative victories during his time in the Senate. On the Republican side, you saw the same thing. 17 people ran in the Republican primary. 9, including Jeb Bush and Chris Christie, had been two-term governors with national name recognition. All of them were easily vanquished. 5 more of the candidates were current or former senators. Only one of them lasted, and that was Ted Cruz, and that was only because he was well known to be a true outsider, and the way people knew that was that his calling card was that most of the Senate hated him, and members of the Senate gleefully confirmed that. So the person ultimately selected by the Republican Party is a man who has never held any public office, never even ran for any other public office, has had no military or other public service in his career, and has expressed disdain for people who have. So the fact that the Republican Party chose Donald Trump as its nominee for president reflects the fact that a lot of Republicans do not trust anyone, Democrat or Republican, who is associated with government as their president. And the fact that Secretary Hillary Clinton lost several states to a previously unheralded senator from Vermont reveals that this isn't a one-party issue. So the question's why? And what are the consequences for Western democracies around the world? Recently, we've witnessed a stunning decision in the UK, where the people of the United Kingdom rejected the recommendation of their prime minister and virtually all leaders across the political spectrum and voted to exit the EU. We've witnessed the people of Colombia reject the recommendation of their elected leader to end a 50-year war with the FARC and effectively vote in favor of continued fighting. We've witnessed the Philippines elect a leader who attacks all politics as usual, belittles allies and alliances, and has authorized the vigilante killings of thousands of people. And even here in Australia, which is relatively sedate by contrast, Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party won 4 seats in the last election. You've had 5 prime ministers in the past 7 years, if you count Kevin Rudd twice. So these are interesting times not only in the U.S. What I'd like to focus on is what is different this time, because many things are actually very much the same. More than half of Donald Trump's supporters are relatively affluent Republicans who support him simply because he's not a Democrat and he won't do the things that Democrats have promised to do, principally raise taxes for the top 1% of wage earners. But they would have voted for any of the Republican candidates. What I'd like to focus on is what is animating those who made him the Republican nominee and helped him defeat all those other traditional Republican candidates. And I believe there are 5 substantial trends that drive them. Most of these trends are global, and they have consequences for all of us. And these are the 5. The fallout from the global financial crisis. The second is demographic change in our workforce. Third is a runaway pace of technology. The fourth is the corrosion of our traditional media. And the fifth is wage stagnation and the concentration of wealth. So let me start with the GFC and with the mood of the public, particularly after that crisis. Now, for 30 years, a little context, because there was some groundwork done first. For 30 years, political leaders on both sides of the aisle in the United States have secured votes by campaigning on the notion that the government's a mess and it couldn't do anything right. And in 2007, those elected proved that was true. Now, President Reagan had demonstrated the power of running for election on the claim government was too big and bloated and ineffective, and he ran on a campaign of cutting taxes and eliminating red tape. His successor, George H.W. Bush, did the same. And to win, he made the same claims, and then he lost when he failed to keep his promise and not raise taxes. So the next president, Bill Clinton, a Democrat, followed the same playbook, leading the charge, and his big statement was that the era of big government was over. In all cases, the message was that we needed less and less government. George W. Bush ran almost entirely on promises to continue shrinking wasteful government. Tom Friedman, the New York Times reporter, had a wonderful insight about this. And it came from his days when he was covering the burger wars between Hungry Jack's and McDonald's. He met with the head of marketing for Hungry Jack's, and he said, with the hundreds of millions of dollars that are being spent on this advertising war, why have you never run any ads just going after McDonald's burgers? Just say they're frozen, tasteless patties or something. And the marketing director looked at him and said, that is the very first rule of marketing. You never kill the category. But we have been killing the category of government for decades in the United States. And then, when government actually let the people down in a massive way, people believed it really was true. Government couldn't do anything right. And in September 2008, the country was already mired in an unpopular war in Iraq, which is costing us our bravest troops and billions of dollars. And then we were hit by a recession that was directly due to the federal government easing banking regulations. The two things that we counted on our government to do most, which is to keep us secure and to protect our economy, it had failed to do. So if anyone was looking for proof that government can't do anything right, that was the moment. But at the time, people were suffering. They were so desperate just to keep their jobs, keep their homes, just keep body and soul together and go working day to day, that they couldn't focus their anger on the government. It took them years to dig out of that hole. And during that time, their energy and focus was on digging out. But now that the U.S. is back, we're back to full employment, home prices are back and above where they were before the crisis, the economy's stable, people finally have the breathing room to avenge their pain. And that's part of what you're seeing, just genuine anger that can finally be expressed. And I think the Brexit vote suggests that the U.S. isn't alone in having this echo effect of the anger of 2007 and 2008. The second major trend in the U.S. relates to demographics. And there are two significant demographic changes that have accelerated dramatically in the last 25 years, and they've had a particularly pronounced effect on white males. Now, before I discuss it, let me first talk about what it was like to be a white male in the 1950s, in the first half of the last century. If you were a straight white male with a high school education or less, you might lose out on jobs or opportunities to college-educated white males, but that was it. You had an advantage over everyone else on the planet. You didn't have to compete against women. You didn't have to compete against people of color. You didn't compete against people who are openly gay or lesbian. And you didn't have much in the way of international competition at all. Industries were largely protected among those countries with which we actually had trade. And about half of the world's economy was locked up in a failed economic system, the Soviet-style communist system, which didn't compete for American jobs at all. So during the 1980s and 1990s, the U.S. economy suddenly changed. Programs to enforce civil rights laws fundamentally changed the workforce, introducing opportunities for women, for racial and ethnic minorities, and for other previously disadvantaged groups that hadn't been able to compete for jobs. And at the same time, the fall of the Berlin Wall was effectively a starting gun for global competition around the world. Suddenly, this talented workforce that had been bottled up in a ineffective economic system was unleashed. And Western nations saw this great opportunity in trading with those countries and working them into their supply chains. And now suddenly, a white male worker who had had a built-in advantage was forced to compete with women, people of color, and people around the globe. People who were hungrier and potentially more competitive than they were, because they had always assumed I have to be twice as good to get the same job. And now they're having a chance. Now, I know there's a lot of ridicule about white privilege and condemnation of white males, but let's just understand where that sentiment comes from. There is a real sense of loss and a resentment and an unfairness that they feel. And that's a real emotion, and probably an emotion that some of us would have felt if we were in similar circumstances. Because even if an advantage was never fair, we still feel pain and possibly anger when it's taken away. And I'll give you an example. Let's say your name begins with the letter A. I always had the advantage of having a name that began with the letter B. So I used to get to line up in the front of the line as a kid. You don't feel you've done anything wrong, just how people line up. And you didn't name yourself, you inherited that name. So, how could anyone blame you for that? But then if you're told that you've had an unfair advantage, and from now on you can only be at the front of the line 1 out of every 26 times. And because you were in the front of the line for so many years, you're going to have to skip a few of those turns at the front of the line. You may feel a little resentful. And now imagine how it feels if it's not lining up for school, but if it's your livelihood and it's your place in society. Now, some of the resentment is not purely economic. There are true prejudices against minorities, against immigrants, or women that help people who've had a historic advantage justify that advantage. And so it's no surprise that some of the people who are the loudest in their support of building a wall to keep out Mexicans or banning Muslim refugees from entering the country also bear very deep prejudices. And there is clearly some misogyny at work when Donald Trump is your standard bearer as a candidate. Most white males are not prejudiced or disrespectful or intolerant, but some of them are. And they tend to be the most outspoken in their wish to go back to the old ways. They're people who are losing hope. And whether they were entitled to those advantages before or not, now they're suffering because they've lost hope. Yeah, all of us want to believe that our lives are going to improve, or at least that our children's lives will be better than ours. But for people who've lost their advantage in the market and have to compete harder than ever just to have the same job, they just don't feel that way. To get a measure of the despair that they feel, consider this. If you are a white male with a college education or less in the United States today, you are the only demographic in the OECD, the developed countries, whose life expectancy is getting shorter. And it's because of self-harm, suicide, drug addiction, or morbid obesity, all different forms of self-harm. So I have no tolerance for bigots and racists and people who cling to advantages that they were never entitled to. But we also can't ignore fundamental humanity of others who are feeling heartbroken, or the people who depend on them and how they feel, their wives and their daughters and their mothers. And that's how you can understand how some people are expressing the views that you see in the U.S. because they feel betrayed by government. Something that they valued has been taken away. The third major trend is the pace of technological change and how it's accelerating. The pace at which our world is being changed is unprecedented, and it's only going to accelerate. Every year, just think about it. The Vice Chancellor was with me in Silicon Valley. Every year there is a new disruption. You remember the digital economy, and then it was the social network, and then it was the Internet of Things, and then it was Airbnb and Lyft and Uber and the sharing economy. And then the following year it was big data. And this year it's machine learning, where machines are actually teaching themselves things that we don't know ourselves. Now, 3 years ago, when I was getting ready to depart Australia, I gave a talk about how driverless cars would soon transform our societies. But that this is going to be a hard transition. It was going to take years before we saw driverless vehicles on the streets. I was wrong about that. As I was coming here to the airport to fly here, the car driving alongside me was a driverless Google car. And in Philadelphia, driverless cars are operating as taxis. As the tech writer, William Gibson, who coined the term cyberspace, once wrote, he said, "The future's already here. It just isn't evenly distributed." Now, I love driverless cars. Self-driving cars, will manifestly improve our lives. They will reduce accidents, deaths, injuries, eliminate insurance costs, property damage. They'll reduce traffic. They will give us more leisure time. They'll reduce stress on the road. They're just going to improve the quality of our lives. Having been an ambassador, trust me, life is much better in the back seat of the car. But that's not how you look at it If you are a 47-year-old truck driver or bus driver or cab driver or forklift operator with a high school education, carrying a lot of debt, and a family to look after, all you see are some elites in San Francisco trying to kill your job and destroy your family. And driverless cars are only one disruptive technology. If you work in a small hotel or motel, you see Airbnb as an existential threat. If you work in manufacturing, you see 3D printing and robotics as direct threats to your job. If you're a bookkeeper, artificial intelligence is an immediate threat to your job. What once took decades to develop can be built in a matter of months now. We can test the impact of a particular set of compounds on thousands of cells simultaneously. We can take the data from every single mobile phone, from every modern vehicle, from every refrigerator and toaster and microwave and desktop, and we can aggregate them and analyze them as fast as the speed of the internet. I was with the director of Google's cutting edge incubator. It used to be called Google X, but that was too cumbersome, so now it's just called X. His name is Astor Teller. He's the son of, or grandson of Edmund Teller, Edward Teller, the Nobel laureate. And he had an uncle who was a Nobel laureate as well. So he had, it's like you. We had two Fulbrighters in the family, just the gene pool's overwhelming. And I asked him what he was worried about with technology. And he said that it's simply going so fast now that no one can control where it's taking us. Archimedes said that if you had a long enough lever, you could move the earth. Well, the lever of technology has extended so long that it takes very little pressure to fundamentally move the earth. This dramatic acceleration of technology affects not only the workers who see their jobs disappearing and who fear these new technologies, but it also explains the disaffection for government by millennials. A few of them are in the audience. For them, it's because they feel just the opposite. Millennials love the new technology. They think it's going to transform the workplace for the better, and they believe the government just doesn't get it. And to them, industry seems to solve more and more problems. Government seems less and less relevant. So while blue-collar workers want to eliminate government that welcomes these technologies, millennials want to eliminate government altogether. Because to them, again, not all of them, but to many millennials, government is becoming less relevant, and for some it's a joke. So whether technology is seen as a threat or as a substitute, the result's the same. Neither certain millennials nor certain blue-collar workers trust traditional politicians to get this right. This brings me to the fourth trend, the media. The fourth major trend is this dramatic change in how we get and interpret the information that guides our decisions in our lives. Media disruptions are always dislocating and confusing. Think before the printing press, I wasn't actually around, but I've read about this. Before the printing press was invented, written documents were drafted by scribes. And those documents were trusted because, frankly, only people with sufficient standing in the community and reputation had the resources to produce these written documents. It was just too expensive and time-consuming for a scoundrel with a crazy idea to produce something in writing. And so people got used to generally trusting things that were written down. When the printing press dramatically reduced the cost of the printed word, all sorts of things could be published that wouldn't have been seen before. And while this actually, over time, improved the flow of critical information, it was also confusing to people who were used to trusting whatever they read. So while one media revolution can be disorienting, as in that case, two right on top of each other can be fundamentally disruptive. So let me talk about the two. One, about 30 years ago, news was generally obtained from one or two local newspapers and 2 or 3 news channels, which usually devoted up to an hour for news. While different papers might cover the same news stories differently, they generally reported the same facts, and they just merely drew different conclusions from those facts. But with the advent of cable news programs, this changed. We created a vehicle for virtually limitless news, And instead of news organizations being forced to decide what were the most important facts that happened each day, they could report on many things that were not necessarily relevant to people's lives, but would boost their ratings. News organizations started to make news into a form of entertainment and compete for viewers in ways that hadn't existed before. And before long, the news balkanized, so that every viewer could pick the news that reinforced their existing worldview and prejudices. In this way, conservatives who didn't trust liberals could find the channel that reassured them that liberals were untrustworthy and capable of the most irrational and diabolical acts, and vice versa. And this is not enough to bring down, and then if this wasn't enough to bring down trust in government, there was a second wave of media disruption that came right on its heels. With the arrival of cell phones and the World Wide Web, suddenly every person with an internet connection could become a journalist and publisher. Before the traditional media had even heard about a story, people were tweeting it, blogging it, uploading it to YouTube, sending it out on Facebook, and effectively getting their story out faster than cable could. So in order to stay relevant, traditional media simply followed suit and began running with whatever came in across the internet, whether it was right, wrong, or in some cases horrifyingly wrong. The notion was that you wouldn't be wrong for too long, and that you needed to publish quickly or you would become irrelevant. And so we have this phenomenon. Oh, and one other piece about this, the algorithms that, whenever you log on and you look for, a vase, and then for the next 3 weeks you keep getting ads about vases, right? Well, if you indicate that you agree with the right, you're going to get lots and lots of information pushed at you for people who believe in right-wing views, and if you demonstrate that you're interested in left, that's what you're going to get. So it's being reinforced in this echo chamber. So we've got this phenomenon where at one point 40% of Americans believed that President Barack Obama was born in Kenya. And it didn't matter that President Obama was born in Hawaii and that his birth had been duly reported and recorded in the newspaper for everyone to see. Bloggers created this lie, sent it around at the speed of the internet, and news channels covered the phenomenon as if it were actual news. And before long, 40% of Americans believed he'd been born in Kenya. To give you some sense of this phenomenon, consider this today. A substantial portion of Americans believe that Michelle Obama is a man dressed as a woman. After this lecture's over, go back, Google it in, is Michelle Obama a man? And you will find some very interestingly photoshopped pictures. Even more believe that climate change is a hoax, that airplane vapor trails are a government conspiracy to spread chemicals to human beings, that vaccinations cause autism, and that toilets in Australia flush backwards. Now, in this environment where facts are ignored and people choose the stories that support their worldview, is it any wonder that a substantial number of voters believe even the most outlandish claims? Which brings me to my fifth and final point, concentration of wealth and wages. And this one really is the fault of a succession of governments, the concentration of wealth, the stagnation of wages. And again, it helps to take a step back and consider public's expectations. Most Americans are not greedy. They don't expect the government to solve all their problems or give them a handout, and they don't expect to live a lavish lifestyle. They expect what we like to call the American dream. That was a natural reality, at least for white Americans in the 1950s. The American dream is pretty simple. You serve your country, and when you complete your service, you come back and you are given the GI Bill, which allows you to receive a college education, and you get a very low interest loan to buy your first home. And with this, and wages at the rates that they were at, you could work 40 hours a week, own a house with a 2-car garage, you could put your kids through college, you could take a vacation every summer, you could receive good health care, you could retire at the age of 65 with decent savings, and you could live out your remaining years modestly, but with dignity. That was it. In the 1960s and 1970s, we didn't actually raise wages, but people didn't notice this very much because we increased equality for women, and so now many families had two wage earners. And a family could now still have the American dream, but it took two wage earners at home to achieve it. And when we ran out of wage earners, again, we didn't raise wages. Instead, we expanded hours. Stores that had been open from 9 to 5 became stores that remained open into the evening and eventually 24 hours a day. People started using overtime and moonlighting to earn enough money to keep the American dream going. But eventually stagnant wages caught up. And so when we ran out of wage earners, when we ran out of hours in the day that people could work, we offered easy credit. People could still have the American dream, but they needed to go into debt in order to have the 2 cars and the nice house and the flat screen TV and the 2-week vacation. And then once the global financial crisis hit and credit locked up and homes disappeared, it struck people that they had not been living the American dream for a long time. They had the same material things that their grandparents had in the 1950s, but instead of relaxing at home as a family each evening and having their weekends to themselves and accumulating savings, they were working all the time, they were constantly stressed, and they were deep in debt, and they were mad. These are the 5 extraordinary trends, converging all at the same time. Over the past 30 years, a perfect storm has formed to produce an election in which a large enough proportion of the American public has backed ideas that have heretofore been unthinkable. Their candidate has encouraged foreign nations to hack his opponent's internet account. He's encouraged nations to obtain nuclear weapons. He's proposed abandoning allies. He's demanded that our largest trade partners pay for a wall to keep their own citizens away from us. And he's called for banning people from entering the country based solely on their religion. The only analogy to this phenomenon was during the Gilded Age, when a similar rapid change in technology, in media, and in demographics all converged and had similar effects on our politics. We think this is an extraordinary time that's never happened before, but think 100 years ago, when you had a similar revolution in technology, media, global integration, demographics all occurring at the same time. In the year 1879, in a 3-month period, both the electric light and the internal combustion engine were both invented. Those 2 inventions alone, just like the integrated circuits that have powered this whole information age and digital world, those 2 inventions over 40 years produced the telephone, the phonograph, motion pictures, cars, airplanes, elevators, x-rays, electric appliances, consumer appliances, highways, suburbs, supermarkets. All of these were phenomenon created in a 40-year period. And it caused politics to go haywire. There were massive disruptions in labor markets, unprecedented levels of migration, and other effects of industrialization. Now, the effects may sound very similar to what's going on today. Popular unrest, especially in Europe and in East Asia, xenophobia, isolationism, violent protests, and the emergence of authoritarians and demagogues around the world. In the U.S., William Jennings Bryan was nominated 3 times for president during this second industrial revolution and Gilded Age. And he offered a bizarre mix of populist messages. He was anti-Darwinism, he was pro-isolationism, he proposed a silver standard, and he favored prohibition of alcohol, which I know was unpopular here in Tasmania. And he stunned the political establishment with the way he campaigned, defying all of the conventional logic. Demagogues flourish when large sections of society feel overwhelmed and fear that they have been left behind. They offer simple solutions to complex problems, and they play on people's fears and their prejudices. And that's where we stand today. Now, I take great comfort in Winston Churchill's observation that America always does the right thing after exhausting every other possibility. We made some decisions during that period, the 1880s to 1920, that we would later regret. But overall, we preserved the fundamentals of what, in fact, has made America great. We remained a nation that ensured religious tolerance, the rule of law, free press, free minds, free movement of capital. We became, in fact, a fairer nation, a more prosperous nation, and a more secure nation, not by abandoning our values, but by preserving them. Nations around the world face the challenges that I have described for America today. The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. The impulse to divide and exclude, to isolate, to create barriers, to resist the future, and to follow false prophets is strong during times like these. And that's why it's precisely at these moments that diplomacy, the art of understanding, of giving order and sense to disorder, of finding common ground, and of bringing people and nations together has never been more necessary. And that's why I came here tonight, and why I'm so honored to deliver a lecture in Sir James Plimsoll's name. His life was devoted to this craft, and he did it at the very highest and best levels. May we be blessed in this year and in the years ahead to have more people, men and women of Sir James Plimsoll's vision and his character. So I'll finish with a reference to the words of one of Jim Plim's admirers. He stated that he believed that by knowing Sir James, quote, "There are quite a number of highly placed foreigners who think of Australians as persons of intelligence, understanding, courtesy, consideration, and a good intention." I'm honored that you've invited a former U.S. ambassador, and I hope that in my own way, I've given you my own sense of the intelligence, the understanding, the courtesy, and the good intentions of your friends, the people of the United States. May God bless us all.
Ambassador Blush has very generously offered to do a Q&A session with us. I imagine the topic will be, we have roving mics. We do, one, oh good. So a raise of hands. I will ask that we ask questions, not cleverly disguised as statements, if at all possible please, or not so cleverly disguised as statements. So a show of hands and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. I think the first was the gentleman just here.
Were you to be Hillary Clinton, which I imagine we could simulate with Photoshop or something, and she seems likely to be the next president, and were you to be wanting to remediate what you've talked about or respond to what you've talked about, what would you be inclined to do? What strikes you as the best path forward, even if it doesn't actually happen?
Well, each one of those requires some different things, and some of them will have to sort themselves out without government. But I'll give my best guess on this. First, just on your premise, it really is too early to tell who's going to win this election. In the U.S., it all depends on who shows up on voting day. So it doesn't really matter what the polls say. It depends on who gets out and vote, and that's why it's different from here in Australia. So I'm not prepared to make a call on the election. But if she were elected, I think one of the issues, wage stagnation, you can address in a few ways. But one of them is simply raising the minimum wage, which hasn't really been raised appreciably. In terms of absolute dollars, minimum wage has been falling over the last 40 years. So just raising that alone would have an impact. I think in terms of the impact of technology and of trade on people's livelihoods, the government has to marry its trade policies and its expansion of new technologies with some policies that allow people to be retrained and to give them time to be trained in jobs of the future. And there are some tremendous opportunities for people who are, who have a high school education and know more to be involved in advanced manufacturing. One of the companies that I've worked with is an Australian-based company, and they have jobs that don't require a college education, and they provide, incomes of over $100,000 for people who are doing those jobs. I think we also need to make college affordable for the first 2 years after high school. The way high school, there's nothing magic about K through 12. The reason that K through 12 was picked, where you would get free public education, was that was a number of years of education that was required for you to be competitive in the economy and to be an informed citizen. Today, if you look at where wages go, and you also look at the knowledge of the public in order to make reasoned decisions about their future, you need 14 years instead of 12. So public education in the U.S. should extend at least 2 more years. Half of your 4-year college, or at least a 2-year community college, should be paid for. These are some of the policies that she's been pushing forward, and I think they're necessary. And she'd have to get the cooperation of Congress to make them happen. But I don't know how else you address those issues otherwise. In terms of the media will sort itself out. I don't think government should make any rules about media. Ultimately, there is a market for relevant, reliable, timely, accurate information. People are willing to pay for that. And they are ultimately not willing to pay for junk. The longer people find that the news is leading them in bad directions, they will look to other news sources. And just as in the period after the printing press was developed, we got newspapers that had high journalistic standards and became the standard bearers and became the ones that drew the most subscriptions and made the most money. I think the same thing will happen in this era. It's just, we're in a transition period and it's going to take a while.
In the past, crises have been resolved often enough through war. That might sound provocative, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that is largely how the Second Industrial Revolution's dislocations were addressed. We had World War I, we had Great Depression, and we had World War II. And then by the time we came out of those, a lot of the old issues didn't seem as bad. And people had more perspective, and they were able to focus on what really mattered. The American dream, as I said, is a modest dream. And during the Gilded Age, people weren't happy unless they were fabulously wealthy. So part of it is sometimes it takes a crisis for people to appreciate what really matters in life. And, let us hope that it doesn't require a war. But I think there has been the global financial crisis, the Iraq War, and I think some of the angst that people are feeling now is creating a sense of crisis. And as Rahm Emanuel, who was Chief of Staff when I was in the White House, liked to say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So now's the time to push through some new rules, new laws that will help address the crisis.
Ambassador, thank you for a generous address. It's been said that the relationship between the presidency and the Congress is, I think it was called the broken branch. Regardless of the result of the presidential election, do you think that there'll be a resurgence in outsider upsets in the congressional elections, both this election and the one that follows?
It's hard to predict where we're going to be with elections going forward. I didn't see the Tea Party being as effective as it was in the early part of the Obama administration, and no one in the Republican Party ever saw a hybrid of the Tea Party and the alt-right eventually displacing the traditional Republican establishment. So it's kind of hard to make too many predictions about it. The one thing that I could say is that I think we're actually moving towards a correction. We're going to have a census in 2020 that will lead to redistricting of the states. when that happened in California, a state which had been declared ungovernable, where the legislature couldn't get anything done and when there was just gridlock, suddenly we passed 2 simple rules by referendum in addition to the redistricting, and California has taken off. It is now, the engine of the U.S. economy again. So I don't think it would take very much. I think there needs some tweaking of our rules. But my experience in California is that it's not as dramatic as people expect it would be to get a legislature to start working again.
I'm going to try and be even on both sides. Belinda's already making moves to preempt.
Ambassador Blush, about 10 years ago, as part of the team that negotiated the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, I'd be interested in your thoughts. What are the prospects for the US assuming the mantle of a leader on global trade liberalisation once again?
Well, notwithstanding the rhetoric in the campaign and the anxiety that I was describing that has, pushed the polls and the politicians away from free trade, even if you listen to the 2 candidates, Donald Trump doesn't say that he's against free trade. He just says that politicians don't know how to negotiate deals, and he would do much better, big, beautiful trade deals that would be perfect, unlike the ones that the politicians do. But he's prepared to, to do trade deals just on his own terms. And similarly, Hillary Clinton said that she had been in favor of TPP in concept and had said that it was on the way to becoming the gold standard for trade agreements, but that in its final negotiations, some things were done that she couldn't agree with, but that if those could be addressed somehow, she supports trade as well. So I think both parties are prepared to lead trade because, frankly, trade is going to happen. It is going to happen. The issue is under whose rules? Is it going to be rules that we think are fair and level the playing field? Or is it going to be some other country's rules that may not be, where they use their power and their leverage to force other people to go with rules that are ultimately not good for global trade and for the economies of some countries? So I think we will step back up into that role. But clearly there was a need to sort of digest what we've already done and reconsider how we explain this to the American public and to the world at large, that trade will be in their benefit, or trade rules will be in their benefit.
We've seen in this election the rise of people like Bernie Sanders and to some extent also in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn.
Yep.
Do you think there'll ever be a time when the US will openly vote in a socialist president?
I think that, again, it's always hard to predict where America will go over time. I think that there are, aspects of American society that already have a socialist component to them. Medicare, Medicaid, the VA hospital, the military, provide housing, provide health care, provide long-term pensions, do a lot of things for those who serve the country in a particular way. So what you're really talking about is whether people will ever get comfortable with that term. I think no. I think Americans don't like that concept. We are very much people who feel that you're responsible for your own destiny, and that while we can work collectively, ultimately you have to take responsibility. And so the notion of socialism, I don't know it works very well in the U.S. On the other hand, I think a lot of policies, if they work, we're also a pragmatic people. And as long as you don't call it socialist, if you call it, health care from the VA, you say, well, okay, that's okay.
I'm desperately searching for millennials.
You're a millennial. You have to ask all the questions.
Well, my question is about millennials, actually, given what you said about the disengagement of some of them. How do you see the role of government changing in the future to remain relevant?
I think government has to become much more nimble and keep up with technology. If you look at how Silicon Valley was developed, it wasn't because you had these great technologists and government got out of their way. It was that you had great technologists in government too. And they came up with the concept of NASA and DARPA and the Human Genome Project, and they invested billions of dollars in those projects. And the things that they produced, it wasn't just sending a person to the moon and returning them safely to Earth, or a backup system for communications in the event of nuclear war. You know, NASA produced things like solar panels and GPS and Gore-Tex and artificial limbs and heart pumps and water purification systems. That all came out of investments by people who were forward-thinking in government and want to make big calls and big bets. And similarly, DARPA produced the internet and and mobile technologies and a whole bunch of other things that we take for granted in our lives. So the issue is you've got to get people who are savvy and technology-minded to feel government is cool again and go back into government. And if you get the procurement rules right, if you make a deliberate effort to recruit people to projects, if you set a site that a vision that people can gather behind, then I think you get government interesting again. And when government was doing those things, people were very proud of our government. We were very proud in the U.S. to see our flag planted on the surface of the moon. A great big hoax.
Thank you again for coming to speak to us. My question is more about what is going to happen once the elections are over. Donald Trump is in the news at the moment saying that he may not accept the decision. So my question, and probably most of the other rest of the world who thinks it's a bit odd that Donald Trump has actually got as far as he has, and that he does in fact have an equal chance at getting this position. One, what can he do to say that he won't accept it? And two, should he not become president, and Hillary does, what can she do to stop whatever it is that he is planning or suggesting, or how is she going to cope with him in the future?
Yeah. Well, I think two things. One is that in terms of the statement that he wouldn't accept the outcome of the election unless he won, his that was a major statement for the United States. There are things that people say in campaigns, and there's always been mudslinging. There's always been convenient populist statements made to gain votes. But this is of a different character. The thing that people have admired about the United States from its inception has been that the people speak, and there is an orderly transition of power. And that in every contest throughout a 240-year history, the loser of that contest has accepted the verdict of the people, has conceded the election to the victor, and has pledged their support of the new president of the United States. That is our tradition. And to step back from that in any way diminishes us in the view of the world. So to me, that is something that if he were to stick to that, he would receive, I think, across the political spectrum, some condemnation, and would receive pressure to reverse course. He had said during the primary initially that he was going to not commit one way or another as to whether or not he would support the Republican candidate if he were not it. And after enough pressure, he relented and said yes, he would support whoever was picked. So he has a history of having changed his mind on those sorts of calls. And I think for the good of the country, and I think for the good of his own position in American history, that he'll reverse course on that, if he's unsuccessful.
I'm going to abuse my position as chair and ask a really quick question on a this election, considering what has happened with Trump and what's happened with Paul Ryan? And you spoke of outsiders, so I'd be really interested to hear your opinions on that.
It will be very interesting. And again, what I tend to do is whenever things are strange in politics, I try and find a reference point in history that gives you some guidance about how we've behaved in the past. Probably a more eloquent way of saying it was Hunter S. Thompson, who was this great political gonzo journalist. And during the 72 election, he wrote, "When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro." So I look for other weird periods in American history. And I didn't have to look very far. If you look at California, the Republican Party had, for decades, it was the cradle of American presidents and one of the pillars of the Republican Party nationwide. California produced, just in consecutive order, they produced Earl Warren, who would have been the nominee for, or would have been a candidate for president, but for the fact that Eisenhower had already promised to support Nixon. So he said, okay, Earl Warren, governor of California, you get the next spot on the Supreme Court, became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Then Nixon was nominated 3 times by the Republican Party to be president. And again, he was a Californian. Ronald Reagan was nominated 2 times to be president. The Republican Party was extraordinarily strong in California. And then what happened? They started going to the right. And they started doing basically what you're seeing in the federal system, where they just, whenever they lose an election, they said the problem is we weren't far right enough. So next time, we're going to get even more committed to this view. And then the public will finally understand. And their numbers kept falling and falling and falling until today, in California, the Republican Party doesn't hold a single statewide office. 0. And they are a super minority in the legislature. I think the leadership of the Republican Party has to look at that example and say, is this really a risk we want to take? Or are we going to recalibrate and find some space back in the middle that we can accept? Things like immigration reform, things like infrastructure bills that have always been bipartisan. Will they come together on those? I think if they do, then they reestablish their brand and make the elections more competitive going forward. If they don't, they may go in the direction of California.
You talked about the divide between those at the top and the bottom. One of the great features of the 20th century was the rise and fall of that version of socialism called communism. Yeah. And from the depths of the Depression, the fact that there was an alternative system out there forced some of those people at the top to go along with reforms that made things better for the middle class. And until we got to Reagan and Thatcher and the fall of communism, things were getting better. But once that competition was no longer there, we went back to let her rip capitalism. So what kind of reforms do we need to take to redress that?
Yeah. No, I mean, if you look at the U.S. healthcare system, there's really no reason why our healthcare system should cost more and produce worse results than other OECD countries. But it does, because we have made it an ideological issue, and we've tagged attempts to collectivize the cost of healthcare as somehow socialist and bad. When it's just, you look at models that work around the world and you don't care what you title it. If it works and reduces the cost for everyone and we all get good healthcare, we should follow that model. We have followed the models of other countries in many instances over the years, and it's always been to our benefit. This time around, with the healthcare reforms that we made in the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, whatever you want to call it, it solved half the problem. It solved the access issue. We had people who couldn't get covered because they had a pre-existing condition, or they were just too poor, and a lot of times it was kids who couldn't get covered. And we have addressed those situations where people couldn't get any coverage at all. On the other hand, we didn't solve the health care cost issue yet, and someone is going to have to dig in and solve that problem. You know, it's creating a drag on our economy. One of two things is going to happen. Either there's going to be a crisis in healthcare that forces it, or there will be a improvement in the quality of our debate and our discourse, where we no longer just demonize things by putting a tag on them, and we just focus on what works and what doesn't work. And I don't know which of those it's going to be. I don't think we necessarily have to have communism in the world for us to recognize ways of improving our systems. But we do need to start learning how our systems got great in the first place. And it's through honest dialogue and through facts, not through the kind of gibberish that is currently driving a lot of policy.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are like quite a lot older than the typical presidents that have come before them, like Obama. He's 70 and I think she's 69. Do you think that means anything? And if so, what do you think it says about the current state of the American politics?
I think it means two things. One is we're all living longer, which is good, you know, living longer, healthier lives. I also think, though, that it's a little bit anomalous. Typically, having seen the wear and tear that the job puts on people, we look for people who are at an earlier stage in life, you know, to try and, you know, take on that stress. If you look at whether it's President Obama or President Bush or President Clinton, all of whom came in at relatively young ages, they looked a lot grayer when they left. And so there is a, you know, there is an effect of the job. I think the reason that those two emerged is because, notwithstanding their age, they're perceived as having extraordinary stamina and the capacity to handle it and a certain resilience. So Donald Trump is seen as, you know, he has been the same person with the exact same hair for, you know, his entire public life. And people are like, he's, you know, he talks the same way, he looks the same way, you know. They think he'll go on forever like that. And same with Hillary Clinton. I think there's a sense of her as she has faced every challenge in public life that you could imagine, and she just she never stays down. You know, takes a punch, she comes right back. So I think with them, it's less about their age than about the quality of the two people.
Don Watson, in his recent quarterly essay, kind of diagnosed like a sort of hyper individualism in the sort of success of Trump's campaign. And I was sort of wondering if I guess like the triumph of that strain in American politics meant that sort of like civic-minded traditional communitarianism wasn't necessarily a pillar of the American right anymore, or that it wouldn't continue to be.
No, you know, I think there have been strains in the Republican Party going back to Lincoln's time. So when Lincoln was elected, there were about 7 different parties fighting for control of that convention, including a group called the Know Nothing Party, which, you know, has some current progeny. And I think you also had a very rugged individualist party, which you saw with the Rough Riders and Teddy Roosevelt. There is a history of these different strains and elements within our country, and they're actually a source of strength. The concern is when any one of them becomes too dominant and starts pushing out that mix that includes communitarianism, includes an egalitarianism, and some other elements that have made America great. So I think you're seeing a rise in them, and it is making people nervous. But I don't see them as the dominant forces, at least today, in our politics.
Thank you for coming tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's nice to see you again.
We all know that President Obama has had a very difficult 8 years in office due to the fact that he has not had a lot of cooperation from the Senate and House. How do you think he is going to be remembered other than being the first black president?
Well, first, I think he had the experience that he expected. You know, he didn't expect this to be easy. I remember during the campaign, which is brutal. I mean, it was a grueling campaign. And at one point we were, I think, grousing about it. And he said, look, this is the hardest job on earth. It ought to be the hardest job interview. And it was. He knew it was going to be the hardest job on earth and that he would be fought at every turn on everything he tried to accomplish. But if you think about the commitments that he made at the outset, whether it was reducing nuclear stockpiles, increasing access to affordable health care, whether it was addressing the nuclear threat from Iran, whether it was increasing trade with other nations, with CAFTA and Korea and others, whether it was putting more people on the Supreme Court who shared certain values and added diversity to the court, whether it was eliminating the ban on service members by gays and lesbians in the U.S. military, whether it was adding sanity to our relationship with Cuba, or whatever it was, he's made enormous progress on the things that he set out to do at the outset. And that doesn't even include massive calls like the rebalance to Asia. So if you look at it in that prism, I think that if he is succeeded by a Democrat, by Hillary Clinton, then he will probably have a legacy similar to what Ronald Reagan had. Ronald Reagan was appreciated much more, in part because he was succeeded by a Republican. His policies were allowed to really take root. And when the Berlin Wall fell in the middle of George H.W. Bush's first term, everyone credited Reagan with being farsighted and for having accomplished that. And his legacy has been high in the U.S. ever since. I think President Obama is on a similar trajectory. A lot of his calls were good ones. I think history will remember him kindly. And if nothing else, even for people who will never like him for whatever reason, whether it is based on prejudice or whether it's simply because they don't like his policies, I don't think anyone will be able to not appreciate the dignity with which he's held office. I don't know any president in my lifetime who has not had any scandals, who has not had people leaving when writing tell-all books and going to jail, who hasn't, occasionally said things that caused Americans to feel embarrassed. I think he has conducted himself with extraordinary dignity, and that people will remember that as part of his legacy. Place to end. Good.
I've been given the task of offering the vote of thanks this evening to Ambassador Blush. No, please stay up here. There's a number of people in the room I know who know that I'm a US politics junkie. And I've mentioned a number of times that I love this time of year. I love US presidential elections. And I've made the comment that I wish they happened more often. However, at this stage of the campaign, I'm not so sure anymore. This has been a rough campaign. It's been exhausting. And indeed, sometimes it's been unedifying. It's been difficult for political scientists and US political observers occasionally. But I am gladdened by your optimism at the end that you offered to us about the state of US politics. And I'm taken by the idea that the US still does offer a degree of a beacon of hope. And I think that's important. I also am really grateful for the insights of an Obama insider, for want of a different term, and someone who's filled several roles during the Obama administration. And I'm grateful as well for the insights into the complexities of what is going on in the US at the moment that can often be just simplified, and we see it often simplified in commentary, and I'm grateful for the insights of you breaking down that complexity this evening, and I'm grateful for you offering an insight into the challenges that will face the incoming president, whoever she might be. So on that note, please join me in thanking Ambassador Bleisch for his wonderful presentation this evening.